Hi, this is Mike Ferguson.
And this is Mike Morford, and we want to tell you about our true crime podcast, Criminology.
Launched in 2017, we've covered every kind of case you can imagine, from puzzling missing persons cases to mysterious murders.
Some of the cases we cover are the biggest in true crime history, or they're high-profile cases that are currently making headlines, while some of the cases are fascinating ones you likely haven't heard of.
We cover both solved and unsolved cases, and we have 300 episodes available to binge on right now, including full seasons on the Zodiac Killer, the Golden State Killer, and Ted Bundy.
You can listen to Criminology on your favorite player or app, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.
You're listening to DNA ID, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1985. Barely, though. It was January 2nd, the beginning of a new year full of promise and potential for Patti Stichler and her 3 daughters. The girls were on winter break from school, and it was cold and dark in the middle of the night in Sylvania, Ohio. But 11-year-old Andrea woke up and needed to use the bathroom. When she did, she noticed her mom's door was open and the TV was on. But it was very, very late. Patti must have fallen asleep. Andrea walked into her mom's room. Patti lay on the floor between the foot of the bed and the dresser. She was face up and mostly naked. Blood was everywhere. Avoiding the blood on the floor and bed, Andrea got to her mom and touched her hair, the only part of her that didn't appear bloody. Patti still looked like Patti, but her vacant eyes just stared upwards. She had a gaping cut on her cheek, and she didn't move. "Mommy, wake up," Andrea said. Nothing. Quick-thinking little Andrea raced to the phone and called her dad, Greg. Her parents were divorced, but Greg spent a lot of time with the kids, and Andrea knew his phone number by heart. She told him, "I'm really scared. I looked into Mommy's room and I saw blood." After some back and forth, Greg told her he would call the police, but she should immediately call the neighbor they were friends with, Mrs. Johnston, and ask her to come over, and not let her sisters leave their bedroom. Andrea called and woke Mrs. Johnston up. She said, "My mom's all bloody. I think she's dead." Greg, absolutely frantic, hung up with Andrea and called the Sylvania Township, Ohio police, reporting a woman injured with lots of blood at 5055 Brenthaven Drive. His call came into dispatch at 1:49 a.m. After he called the police, he called the house back and kept Andrea on the phone. Meanwhile, the neighbor, Mrs. Johnston, rushed over to Patti's and knocked on the front door, which was locked. Seeing her, Andrea unlocked it and let her in. Mrs. Johnston spoke to Greg briefly on the phone and then went into the master bedroom. Then she walked right back out and went outside to await the police, whose lights she could see approaching. Sylvania Township Patrolman Frank Glinka was on the scene at 5055 Brenthaven Drive by 1:52 a.m., responding to the call of a woman down. Mrs. Johnston led him into the house. 3 little girls were in the first bedroom. 2 were in bed and 1 was standing in the doorway. That was Andrea, the one who had found her mom. When he saw Patti, the officer knew he needed backup. The master bedroom was a bloodbath. He radioed for Officer John Welsh, who arrived and accompanied Officer Glinka to the bedroom. Peering around the foot of the bed in the dim light of the TV and illuminated closet light, he could see that the woman on the floor was never going to be a mother to her girls again. When the rescue squad arrived and Commander George Milliere took a look at Patti, he didn't need to check for a pulse. There was nothing to be done. Officer Glinka quickly ushered Mrs. Johnston and Patty's 3 girls, Andrea, Kirsten, and Elise, out of the house. But first, he let the 2 little ones use the bathroom. He then carried Elise and Kirsten, with Andrea and Mrs. Johnston following close behind. He put them all in his squad car and drove them down the block to Mrs. Johnston's house. In the meantime, Officer Welsh noticed the phone was off the hook in the house. He picked it up and asked if anyone was there. Greg was on the other end and he was hysterical. He asked if the girls were safe. Welsh assured him that they were, but Greg became more excited and hung up. The officers summoned the town's small detective squad to the scene. They had a homicide on their hands, and a nearly 40-year investigation commenced. At 6:06 a.m., Patty's body was transported out of the house by Walker ambulance. When she arrived at the autopsy suite, an inventory was taken of her clothing and personal possessions. She wore an inside-out black sweatshirt that appears to have had the neck cut off, flash dance style. She was also wearing a gold ring and a charm necklace. Dr. Christopher Delsey, the Lucas County pathologist, saw that 30-year-old Patty's throat had been cut severely on both sides. She also had been stabbed 19 times with a knife in the abdomen and chest. Some of the stab wounds delivered through her sweatshirt. It appeared that the suspect kept stabbing Patti after she was dead. Some of these wounds barely bled, even though 2 of them nicked the heart, the liver, and 1 lung. But Patti had stayed alive long enough to fight. Her fingers and lower arms were badly cut, most likely from trying to defend herself. She also had a stab wound in her cheek and 51 minor cuts on her body. Patty's tox screen was negative for drugs and alcohol. Dr. Delsey ruled that the cause of death was exsanguination due to multiple stab wounds and slashes to the throat, and the manner of death was homicide. Patty's sweatshirt and jewelry were collected, as were head and pubic hair samples and her 8 remaining fingernails, which were false nail tips. Swabs were collected from her vaginal, oral, and rectal areas. A hair found inside her vagina was also collected, in case it was suitable for comparison to a suspect. Let's talk about Patti. Patricia Ann Stichler was born on June 5, 1954 in Ohio, to Father Almond, aged 29, and Mother Marcia, also 29. Patti had a brother named Robert and a sister named Carol. Another brother, James, was killed in a car accident in 1966 when he was just 16. Patti grew up in Sylvania, a small Toledo suburb, attending McCord Junior High and Sylvania Northview High School. Right after graduation on June 17, 1972, and only 12 days after her 18th birthday, she married her high school sweetheart, Greg Oldham. They had met Patti's sophomore year. Greg was a big, burly blonde guy, in stark contrast to Patti, who was brunette, 5'4" and barely 110 pounds. The two had 3 adorable daughters together, Andrea, Elise, and Kirsten. Patti was a stay-at-home mom for several years and then followed her dream to become a trainer and fitness instructor at a local chain of health clubs. She had a lifelong commitment to dancing, aerobics, staying active, and healthy eating. Greg and Patti were married 11 years. From what I gathered from the detective's notes, Patti loved Greg and was faithful to him, but Greg was unfaithful to her for years. He was a bar owner and stayed out until 5 a.m., hanging out with all sorts of people. Patti's friends said she knew deep down about Greg's transgressions, but refused to believe it. She enjoyed being married, being a mom to her girls, and didn't want to rock the boat. But finally, after women kept calling the house and she kept finding phone numbers in Greg's pocket, enough was enough, and the couple divorced in 1984. They were separated for months before it was official, and there was a lot of going back and forth about getting back together. It was very evident that Patti and Greg led inextricably intertwined lives and remained close, co-parenting the girls. But Patti was shaken up by the divorce and her work situation as well. She had worked for 21st Century Health Spas for over 7 years and had worked her way up to manager of one of the gym branches. She was a hard worker with a good record and was ambitious. She was also a somewhat assertive person who came across as competent and confident, which benefited her in a customer service industry. She taught aerobics classes and training sessions, and she loved it. But she took a 2-month leave of absence in the wake of the divorce and then left the company permanently after she was moved to a branch she didn't like. She went to work for R.L. Polk for a short time, but that didn't work out. When she was killed, she was unemployed. Greg paid child support for her and the kids, and she and the girls stayed in the 3-bedroom Sylvania home they had shared with Greg in better times. Interviews with Patti's close friends, of which she had several, indicated that after her marriage broke up, she seemed to want to get out there a little more. She loved to go out and dance and act a little bit flirtatious, but nothing progressed beyond flirting. Her friend Linda Black described her as full of life, bubbly, and gorgeous. Every single picture of her I've seen shows her smiling from ear to ear. While she and Greg were separated, Patti had a several months-long affair with a married man she worked with named Mark F. Mark was a ladies' man who admitted he'd been pursuing Patti for 2 years before they got together. Police would be quite interested in him. Patti had met her current boyfriend, JR, at her New Year's Eve party on December 31st, 1983, before her divorce was finalized in March of '84, and they'd been together ever since then. Patti's friends differed on where she stood on that relationship, but no one doubted that she was faithful to JR. The night before her murder was their first anniversary as a couple. Speaking of the night of the murder, Kirsten, who was 9 when her mom was killed, later talked to the Toledo Blade about the night of the murder. Quote, "We went to bed, and the next thing I know, I wake up and there's police officers walking down my hallway, standing in my bathroom. No one's speaking to me or telling me what's going on. I tried to get out of bed to find out what's happening, and my sister Andrea approaches me and is trying to protect me and keep me away from trying to go find my mom." After the police took the girls to Mrs. Johnston's house and questioned them there, they were picked up by Patti's parents and brought back to their house. Again, the Blades interview with Kirsten talking about her grandfather, quote, "I remember very vividly one tear streaming down his cheek when he picked us up. I didn't know what had happened to my mom. I didn't understand. I was a little girl." Kirsten told the Blade that no one told the girls that their mom had been killed. She later found out from a newspaper headline. She said, quote, "They had lied, quite honestly, but I think that was because they didn't know what to say. How do you tell a little girl that someone brutally murdered her mother and not scare the hell out of her?" Andrea, Elise, and Kirsten lived with their Stichler grandparents for a month while their dad, Greg, found a bigger apartment for them all. Never again would their mother make them do jazzercise with her in the living room in the evening. Their lives were changed forever. Okay, let's go back to the night of the murder before Patti's body was removed and autopsied. Detective Thomas Corrin, one of only 3 detectives on the Sylvania police force, was in charge of the scene. When Sylvania Police Dispatch called him at home and told him they had a murder, he told them to instruct the officers at the scene to secure the perimeter. He arrived at 2:10 a.m., and when he drove up to the home, he saw 3 uniformed officers standing in the driveway, detaining a large white male. The man was yelling and looked angry. Corrin thought there might be a fight. Officer Walsh told him the man was Greg, the ex-husband of Patti Stichler. Officer Glinka said Greg had been called by Andrea. He was still on the other end of the phone when Officer Welsh had checked the line, and he appeared to be in shock and was non-cooperative. Upon instructions from Detective Corrin, Greg was removed to the Sylvania police station for questioning by Detectives Palmer and Burr. Corrin stayed at the scene to start the investigation. The house was a small, white, single-level ranch in a nice residential neighborhood populated by families. The houses were fairly close together. The neighbor's house in the rear is visible in crime scene photos of Patti's house. A small driveway was right outside her front door. Detective Corrin was led inside by Officer Glinka, who advised him that he hadn't touched anything, which wasn't really true because he had let the girls use the bathroom. The hallway light leading to the 3 small bedrooms was illuminated. The officers had to enter the master bedroom in order for the detective to see what was going on. The closet light was on and the TV was on, so the lighting was dim but sufficient for Corrin to see that Patti's throat had been cut by large slicing wounds. She lay on her back, her head leaning to the left, hands almost peacefully curled on her chest, her left elbow partially under the dresser, her right leg extended with the left knee slightly bent, the knee leaning up against the dresser, and her left ankle crossed over her right. A black sweatshirt covered her torso, but she was nude on the lower half. Puncture wounds marred her stomach. Corrin closed the bedroom door and instructed that no one was to enter until the CSIs arrived. Then Officer Welsh led Corrin into the bathroom. The room had a bathtub that doubled as a shower, the kind where the tub and shower are surrounded on 3 sides by tiled walls. Around the shower was a clear waterproof curtain. Set in the wall on the far side of the tub was a window, and one look at the window told the detectives all they needed to know about how Patti's killer got into and or out of the house. The brown plastic drapes obscuring the window from outsiders' eyes had been cut away. The plastic weather sheeting sealing the window from the cold was slashed. The window gaped open. Blood smears were visible on the windowsill, the tub wall edge where someone had held on, and on the tub bottom where someone had stood, although this later was thought to have possibly been from a fireman checking out the window. Corin closed the bathroom door. The suspicion that the killer had come in through the window and cut away the curtain to provide easier exit was bolstered when there was no sign of forced entry on the front door. But then, the girls told the detective that Patti didn't lock the windows or the doors. Because the bathroom window had not been jimmied or forced, it was believed that it had indeed been unlocked. The girls also said the bathroom window was never left open. It was winter in Ohio. It was 28 degrees that night. The window opening was rectangular, only 1 foot and 3 inches high and 2.5 feet wide. Because the house was only a single-level home, it would have been relatively easy for the killer to climb in the window, the bottom of which was only 3 feet and 8 inches from the ground. The debate about whether the man who killed Patti came in through the window or just left that way has never been resolved. Lucas County Coroner Dr. Harry McNary announced to the media that the intruder had apparently used the window for both ingress and egress. But Detective Greg Burr, who investigated this case for years, wasn't so sure. He came to believe that Patti knew her killer and had let him into the house. Patti's mom, Marcia, also told the investigators that she warned her daughter many, many times to lock the door, and Patti never listened. So whoever killed Patti could have just let himself in through the main entrance. After he killed her, he went into the bathroom to clean himself up, leaving all the blood smears and drops they found. When Andrea got up to use the bathroom, he had no choice but to exit hastily out the window to avoid being seen by the 11-year-old. Corin called Lieutenant David Bell to report that he had a crime scene with probable intruder. He requested Officer Welsh to string yellow crime scene tape up around the house and yard. He requested Detectives Palmer and Burr to return to the scene. And he placed a call to the coroner's office, and coroner's investigator Richard Roberts soon arrived. Lieutenant Bell and the chief of police himself, Gerald Saab, also arrived. Assistant prosecutor Robert Pizik came to the scene and was updated. The small residential lot in the peaceful neighborhood was crawling with police. The investigators observed the scene in Patti's room. The door of the room opened up right next to the head of Patti's king-size bed. On the opposite side of that wall of the bedroom was the bathroom. Blood spray was evident on the walls near the head of the bed, the door jamb, and the back of the door. There was a massive bloodstain on the upper left quadrant of the bed, closest to the door. Patti lay on her back at the foot of the bed, wedged between the bed and the dresser. A bloody floral comforter from the bed was partially on the bed and partially next to and under Patti's legs. Blood soaked the carpet under her body. The stains, spray, and general disarray of the bedclothes and other items strewn around the room led to the obvious conclusion that Patti had been attacked in or on the bed. Somehow she had ended up on the floor at the foot of the bed, lying parallel to the base of the bed and the dresser opposite it. Detectives noted that the bifold closet had one door open and the 25-watt light was on, something they would learn Patti typically left on at night. A pair of women's blue Calvin Klein bikini underpants was found on the floor near the head of the bed. Close-up examination would reveal that they had been cut on the left-hand side and partially cut on the right. A decorative pin, the kind that was popular in the 80s that read Rocky Horror Picture Show, was found on the floor on the same side of the bed as the bloodstain, the side closest to the door. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was a campy faux horror musical that we all loved back then. No one knew Patti to wear this pin, and it didn't belong to her girls, who were definitely not old enough to see this movie. Sylvania PD Officer Jack Welsh documented the scene in sketches and made itemized lists of all the evidentiary items observed. Meanwhile, Toledo Police Officer John Michalak was dispatched to assist the Sylvania police officers, and he arrived at 4:45 a.m. The Sylvania investigators knew they needed help from the big city squad. Detective Corin showed Michalak the scene in Patti's bedroom. He took photos with 35mm film in both color and black and white. Then he collected the following items into evidence. The brown bathroom switch plate with a small smear of blood on it. A blood sample from the wall near the towel rack, about 3.5 feet above the floor. A blood sample from the lower right window ledge. The bedspread sheets and pillows from the bed. Patti's purse. The cut brown bathroom window curtains and plastic backing from the bathroom window. The Rocky Horror button. 2 towels that were draped over the tub edge in the bathroom that had blood in them. The carpet under Patti and elsewhere in the room that had blood stains and spray on it, amounting to more than 1/3 of the entire carpeting. a sex toy from the dresser, Patti's keys, a matchbook and Pabst Blue Ribbon cup found under the bed, a bottle of Halston perfume found near Patti's head, the orange telephone found on the floor on the other side of the bed, and a heating pad on the bed that was plugged in and turned on. Also found were 2 of Patti's false fingernails, one on the bed and one on the floor. CSI Michalak also dusted for latent prints in the bathroom and outside the bathroom window. Some prints were found and lifted from a wall at the end of the bathtub. Once Patti's body was removed, a handprint was found on the carpet underneath her head and another under the dresser right next to her. This led to speculation that in the struggle, Patti's attacker had dropped his knife and had to reach under the dresser to find it. All of these collected items were sent to the Sylvania Police Department to be entered into evidence. Some things were then sent to the Toledo Police Department Regional Crime Lab for analysis. These included Patti's underwear and sweatshirt, the 2 broken fingernails found on the floor, the oral, rectal, and vaginal swabs to be examined for semen, hair samples from Patti and the one found inside her vaginal cavity to be compared to see if it was hers or foreign. When tests on all these things came back after a month, the vaginal swabs showed the presence of 2 to 3 day-old sperm, nothing fresh, and no semen anywhere. This led to the conclusion that Patti had not been raped. The 2 fingernails that had been broken off and found on the floor did not have any detectable biological material under them. Although it was clear that Patti had fought back, she had not managed to get a piece of her attacker. Even though it was the dead of night, Detectives Corin and Burr went to Mrs. Johnston's house to talk to Patti's girls. Patti's 3 little daughters were sat down by detectives at 3:20 a.m. I can't even begin to imagine how scared and upset they must have been, although, as you heard Kirsten tell the Blade, they weren't really told what was going on. Despite the trauma they must have been feeling, detectives' notes describe 11-year-old Andrea, who summoned help after finding her mom, as very articulate. The girls had spent New Year's Eve and New Year's Eve Day with Patti's parents, their grandparents Almond and Marcia. Patti had picked them up right before 6 p.m. It was starting to get dark and it was raining and cold. They went home and watched the movie The Poseidon Adventure on TV. Then they caught the end of Victor Victoria. Patti was a big Julie Andrews fan. Kirsten spilled some Sprite in the kitchen and it had to be cleaned up, and then they went to bed. The time was about 11:30. Andrea said that one thing she remembered about the night was that the phone kept ringing, and they would answer it and the person would hang up. This happened 4, maybe 5 times. Andrea slept in her own room, and Elise and Kirsten shared a room. I'll note here that it was possible that Andrea had her vaporizer on for a cough, and the machine might have made noise, drowning out sounds from her mom's room across the hall. She didn't mention this in her 1985 interview, but it came up when she was re-interviewed in 1998. Andrea did not know why she woke up that night. She said she got up to go to the bathroom and opened her door right across the hall from her mom's room. Glancing in, she saw her mom was lying on the floor, but Andrea was focused on peeing. She couldn't recall whether the bathroom door was closed, but she felt like it might have been. She said it was always left open. She walked into the bathroom, sat down to pee, and she felt cold, but the lights were off, so she couldn't see what was going on. She stood up and noticed the short window curtains were cut and dangling, and the window was open. She got a very petrified feeling. She thought she was dreaming, but she climbed on the tub edge and put her hand to the window, and it was indeed wide open. She went back toward her bedroom, and that's when she saw that something was wrong in her mom's room. Her mom was lying on the floor. All she could see was her knees and below. She went farther into the dimly lit room, saw the blood on the floor, hopped over the blood onto the bed, avoiding the blood there, and went down the end of the bed to her mom's head on the floor. Her mom's eyes were open and she was still. Andrea could not wake her. Andrea said she grabbed her mom's purse off the dresser, somewhat illogically in case of a robbery, and again leapt over the blood, took the purse out of the room, and set it in her sister's room. She said in a later interview, quote, "I remember just kind of jumping back out of the room, walking to the kitchen, and I said, holding my ears like this, I said, please, please, if someone is here, just leave. I'm scared. Please." I just felt petrified and helpless. I walked to the family room and actually turned on the family room light. After she checked the house, she prodded her sisters, but they were too sleepy to wake up, so she went to the phone. Andrea said she'd been trained to remember emergency phone numbers because sometimes Patti left her in charge of her sisters, but in her panic, she forgot them all. So she called Greg, her dad, and said, I'm scared. I think we were robbed. Something bad happened in Mom's room. Greg said, what do you mean? Put your mom on the phone. Andrea, she can't talk. Greg more urgently, put your mom on the phone. Andrea, I don't think she has a pulse. Again, Greg said, what do you mean? Put her on. Andrea said, let me check for a pulse, and she put the phone down and walked back to the bedroom, where she felt her mom and thought, nope, no pulse. She picked up the phone and told her dad that Patti was dead. He told her to call the neighbor, and after he called the police, called back and stayed on the phone with Andrea until the police arrived. Andrea remembered that the front door had been locked when she opened it for Mrs. Johnston. Here is an exchange from the interview. Detective Burr, Andrea, let me ask, what made you wake up, do you know? Andrea, nothing, I had to go to the bathroom. Detective Burr, okay, no noise or anything woke you up? Andrea, I didn't hear anything. Detective Burr was skeptical. He suspected that Andrea heard something or even saw something and was repressing the memory. The scenario in his head went like this. Andrea hears a struggle or a fight in Patti's room. She gets up and Patti's killer had closed himself in the bathroom trying to clean himself up. There were lots of small blood smears and drops in the bathroom, including a tiny smear of blood on the light switch right inside the door. When he heard Andrea's door open, he climbed into the tub, cut the window coverings in order to get out, and smeared some blood on the wall and tub on his way out. He climbed out into the night and ran into the darkness. This all assumed he came in through some means other than the window. If he did come in through the window, all the curtains would have been cut already, and he could have slipped out of the window within mere seconds. Kirsten was interviewed too and said that on the night of the murder, she and Elise were put to bed after the movie ended, and she recalled hearing noises on the rock bed outside her bedroom window. This frightened her, and she wanted to go sleep in her mom's room, but her mom wouldn't let her. She chalked the noises up to childhood imagination. But Elise heard the noises on the rock bed outside their window too. Unfortunately, it's unclear whether the two revealed this in their original interviews or in their 1998 interviews. That's the first time I saw any reference to the girls hearing something outside their window. Of course, it matters greatly, because if they did indeed both hear those noises, what it means is that the guy was watching them through the windows while they watched the movie and knew when the girls had been put to bed. The house was processed for several hours by all the evidence techs and photographers and sketchers and measurers. They wrapped up around 11 a.m. In daylight, Sergeant John Barco was searching the grounds outside the house and located something important. It was a 5.5-inch long black nylon rectangular knife sheath with blood on it, lying on the concrete walkway outside Patti's garage, which was very near the bathroom window. 2 drops of blood were found on the concrete walkway as well, leading away from the window. The killer had dropped the sheath on the way out. Other things observed outside the house once the sun rose was a pile of likely human feces outside Patti's bedroom window. According to the notes in the case file, this was dismissed as unlikely to be involved, and it was not collected or photographed, something I think was a mistake. Police determined that it was trash pickup day in the neighborhood, so they searched all the trash cans that were out on the street for a few blocks. They also searched the area with metal detectors to check bushes throughout the neighborhood. They did not find the murder weapon. Investigators started to establish a timeline for Patti's last hours. Patti and her boyfriend JR had thrown a New Year's Eve party at Patti's house for at least 20 people on December 31st. The girls had stayed at their grandparents' house so Patti and her friends could ring in the new year. The party was a success, with people staying over until after 2 a.m. JR and Patti's friend Sandy both slept over, with Sandy on the couch. They all slept in, and Sandy left after noon. Patti drove JR home about 5 p.m. as he didn't drive. They stopped for groceries, and then she dropped him at the apartment where he stayed with a roommate. After that, she went and picked up the girls at her parents'. She was invited to stay for dinner, but she said she was tired and wanted to go home. They packed up a plate of food for her. At home, Patti and the girls watched The Poseidon Adventure and Victor Victoria in Patti's room. The girls remembered that the phone rang, with hang-ups several times, including as late as 11:15. Patti put the girls to bed right after 11:30. Andrea said she played with her Cabbage Patch doll and didn't go to sleep right away. Detective Burr guessed she might have been up until after midnight. Andrea said later she believed her mom showered before she got into bed. So the timeline put Patti in bed about 11:45 or a little after. Based on the way the pillows were positioned and the TV on, it was believed Patti was sitting in bed watching TV with the heating pad on her back. Her girls said this was very typical as she always had back pain from exercise. Detective Burr believed that Patti was attacked on the bed where the heaviest concentration of blood was. The sheets were stained with a big, saturated puddle of blood where Patti would have been lying, and spray on the carpet next to the bed, the door jamb, and the wall near the doorway closest to the head of the bed indicated her throat was cut right there. While she was bleeding, Patti fell or rolled or was dragged onto the floor at the foot of the bed, taking the comforter with her. She was stabbed further as she lay on her back, punctures to her abdomen releasing little blood, indicating that she may have already been dead. The scores of stab wounds were overkill. It was not clear at all when Patti's underpants were cut off her and how they got to where they lay on the carpet next to the bed. All of this put the window of time for the crime between 11:45 and 1:40 a.m. when Andrea walked into the room. So, to reiterate, Patti had not been raped, but she had been attacked while lying or sitting in bed, heating pad on her back, wearing a sweatshirt and underpants, a typical sleeping outfit for her. Her underwear was cut off and her throat viciously cut, not necessarily in that order. And her body was stabbed over and over after she was dead, including some shallow, almost exploratory stab wounds. So police had a couple of theories. One was that Patti's attacker was someone close to her, who was very angry with her. He, almost certainly a he, had lost it and stabbed her over and over in a rage. Perhaps he was jealous, as the severing of the underwear suggested. Clearly, Patti was targeted, as the girls in the next rooms were untouched. But another line of thinking was that Patti was attacked by an intruder with sexual assault in mind, who had panicked and quickly silenced Patti when she resisted. It was unclear whether the assailant knew that there were 3 children sleeping in adjacent rooms, but police thought it possible that something had interrupted him and he had to flee the scene without completing the sexual assault because of fear of detection. And if that was the case, he was right to be scared. Andrea came into the room just after 1:40, wakened by something she couldn't put her finger on. It seemed likely that she just missed the suspect slipping out the window and into the dead of night, or maybe she saw him and had shut out that terrifying memory. There was a lot of evidence pointing to an unknown intruder: the open window, the knife sheath, the noises outside the house, a possible pile of human feces. But that was not where the investigation went. Detective Burr wrote, quote, "There seems to be a consistent opinion among law enforcement and experts consulted that the subject was known to her," end quote. Burr believed it was a sexually motivated crime and the sexual aspect would lead them to the suspect. For this reason, the investigators asked a lot of people about Patti's sex life. A vibrator on the dresser suggested to Detective Burr that maybe there had been a planned sexual encounter that night, maybe some role-playing, and the whole thing had gone horribly wrong. This investigative focus on someone Patti was involved with would lead investigators down the wrong path for decades to come. Let's talk about some more information that police uncovered. Based on the knife sheath, which was very flat and rectangular, they did some research at sporting goods stores and learned that the sheath was for a butterfly-type knife. This kind of knife hinged closed into the handle. Butterfly knives typically had a double-edged blade about 4.5 inches long, consistent with what the pathologist had observed. Police conducted a neighborhood canvass and interviewed people who lived in the thickly settled area. The notes from the knock and talk are apparently long gone, or officers just didn't write it down if neighbors had nothing to report, which was the case with most of them. Virtually no one had seen or heard anything that night. One neighbor, Andrea J., reported that she walked her boyfriend Joe out to his car on the night of January 1st around 11:30 p.m. Parked outside her house and right across from Patti's, there was a very nice car, possibly an Audi, with a luggage rack. Police were unable to determine whose car this was. It did not belong to a resident of the block. Because this was a residential block and no one claimed the car, police remained very interested in it. But even more important than the vehicle angle was the incident police learned had happened to Patti. The next-door neighbor, whose house was very close to Patti's, was named Alice A. Alice's boyfriend, Lloyd, left her house at around 11:45 or 11:50 on the night of January 1st, and when he left, he noted that Patti's bathroom light was on. This might have been when Patti was taking a shower before bed. But more importantly, Lloyd had had a recent interaction with Patti. Patti's boyfriend, JR, told Detective Burr that on the Friday night right before New Year's Eve, Lloyd came over very late, between 1 and 2 a.m., and told Patti that there was someone peeking through her windows. Lloyd had scared them off with a gun, but warned Patti about peeping Toms and closing her window shades at night. Patti had told some people at her New Year's Eve party about this, and they all laughed about her leaving her curtains open and teasing the neighborhood teenage boys. Another set of neighbors, Robert and Lucille McGreevy, also reported that Patti was in the habit of leaving her window curtains open. Detective Burr's notes reflect that he was able to track down 2 teenage boys, neighbors who admitted to peeping in the windows. The peeping Tom angle was dismissed, even though, it seems to me, a pile of feces outside Patti's window could logically have been left there by someone who was spying on her in the dark. Instead, they were totally focused on the men in Patti's life. Let's talk about the New Year's Eve party Patti and JR threw, because police focused very heavily on it. The guests included a mix of JR's friends, most of whom he'd known for years from places like the nearby go-kart raceway and the gym. These included guys named Kyle, Jim, Mark, and Tom. Then there were Patti's friends, her friend Sandy, Stephen J., a friend of Patti's from 21st Century, and his girlfriend Nancy, Kathy K. and her boyfriend, and some others. It was a modest crowd of about 20. Some of JR's friends came in a limo because they were friends with the guy who owned the limo company. And yes, even the limo driver, Jack C., was questioned, in case he had decided to return to Patti's house late night. Detectives were fairly certain that they would find the motive for Patti's murder among the partygoers. It just seemed too coincidental that Patti had been killed in her own home right after hosting a bunch of people in her home. However, most attendees told the investigators nothing unusual happened at the party. There was drinking, dancing, and chatting, and some mild drug use going on in the bedroom. Patti was blasting Donna Summer on the stereo. The only thing that happened was Patti's friend Sharon D. and her husband Kevin got into an argument and left early. Kevin was jealous and upset that Sharon and Patti had gone into the bedroom with a couple of guys and closed the door. Kevin was described as a bit of a dick by several of the partygoers. More on him later. Let's talk about the Sylvania investigators' chief suspects. Detective Burr was convinced that Patti had let her attacker into the house in a planned liaison, despite the girls and Patti's parents saying she never would have answered the door in her underpants. Burr's report says clearly, whoever went over there knew her, no doubt about it. The men in Patti's life were scrutinized under a microscope, and most stayed on the suspect list for decades. Let's take them in order. Mark F. was the regional manager for 21st Century Health Spas, and was the man with whom Patti had had an 8-month affair. Mark was married and his wife was pregnant at this time. Patti knew this, but clearly, after 11 years of being faithful to a man who cheated on her, she was feeling inclined to sow her oats a little. Mark might even have told her that his wife was fine with it. At first, Mark lied in his statement to police, totally downplaying his relationship with Patti. He told them the two had been intimate only 5, maybe 6 times. Patti's friends said on the contrary, the two of them were hot and heavy for 8 months, and their daytime liaisons were common knowledge at work. They described this affair as quite torrid. Mark liked things a little risque in the sex department. He bought Patti a lot of sexy lingerie from Fredericks of Hollywood and so on. But Patti cut Mark off after meeting JR, and he was upset when he was dumped. When police pushed Mark in his interview, he admitted that he'd been trying to get with Patti for 2 years before she finally caved, and that they saw each other for months. Police notes point out that Mark had a massive cocaine problem and had been let go from his job because of it. The obvious question was Mark bitter about the breakup, perhaps jealous and all hopped up on coke? Could that have driven him to knock on the door or climb in the window and stab Patti to death? It wasn't out of the question at all. Mark stayed on the list. Now let's talk about JR, Patti's boyfriend of exactly 1 year. JR was nearly 10 years older than Patti and already thrice divorced. I have to say there was a lot of conflicting information about JR and Patti's relationship in the case file. Patti's daughter Andrea said JR and her mom got along great. She never saw them fight. The girls liked him a lot. They went to summer barbecues and he took them to the pool and for ice cream and bought them Cabbage Patch dolls, which were all the rage and very hard to find. Andrea said he was one of the girls' best friends. He never said anything bad about their dad, and he was nice to Patti. Andrea had the impression her mom and JR were in love. He stayed over most nights, but then toward the end he stayed over less and Patti seemed slightly less upbeat. But after the New Year's Eve party, she told her girls she was happy. She said it was like a fun first anniversary celebration for the couple. Some of Patti's closest friends, on the other hand, told the detectives she was over JR and wanted out of the relationship. They said that while she seemed happy on the outside, she had been burned by Greg and just desperately wanted someone to love her again. JR was not into commitment and seemed like a bit of a player. Detective Burr agreed. JR was his number one suspect. He perceived that JR was some kind of gigolo who did not work and sponged off Patti. His notes indicate that JR had a spotty work record and he wore his shirt unbuttoned and worked out a lot. He stood 6'2", weighed 200 pounds, and was, quote, put together. He liked fancy cars, but had lost his license after a DUI and didn't drive, so he borrowed Patti's or his roommate's car. He lived rent-free with a male roommate, which Detective Burr found very odd. Even JR's friends described him as a total womanizer, although most said that he said Patti was different. Police were prudishly intrigued that JR and Patti apparently had an adventurous sex life and used sex toys. There was also some information from her personal physician that I won't go into that suggested that perhaps JR was not faithful to Patti. A quote from the police report says, "It was common practice for him to call at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. to either come over and have sex or ask her to come over to his place." Well, 1 a.m. sounded like a very familiar time to the investigators. Perhaps JR had come over for a late-night booty call. Patti rejected him or tried to dump him, and he lost it and killed her. All of these eyebrow-raising factors pointed to JR's possible guilt, but they paled in comparison to JR's own behavior with the police. At 4:48 a.m. on the very night of the murder, after learning from the girls and Greg that Patti was dating JR, Detective Burr and Uniformed Officer Rhodes went to the apartment JR shared with his male roommate and banged on the door. The man who answered the door had a partially grayed beard, identified himself as the roommate, and said that JR wasn't there right now. He refused to open the door more than 2 inches and appeared very nervous. The cops asked various questions about when JR would be back so they could talk to him. The man sort of evaded their questions, and they finally said they needed to talk to JR because his friend Patti had been in an accident. The man's expression did not change at all. "I'm sorry, I can't help you," he said. Detective Burr could tell that this guy was lying. Burr said to the man, quote, "I have a feeling that JR is in the apartment and he possibly might have been involved in the accident too, and I would hate to leave here and find out later that he was here. It could get you into trouble." The man at the door still would not let them in. Burr told him that Patti's kids were anxious to get in touch with JR too. The guy said, "Well, let me put some pants on." He closed the door and reopened it with pants on. Then he let them in, still seeming very nervous. One of the officers told him it was a bad idea if he was hiding JR in the apartment, and at this point the man admitted he was JR. He had lied about who he was because he didn't know why the cops were there and he was scared. Okay, can we all agree that that is not normal? The fact that JR pretended to be someone else and did not bat an eye when they said Patti was in an accident was not lost on the officers. Now that the cat was out of the bag, JR asked if Patti was okay and was told she was dead. He immediately asked about the kids. He consented to go to the station for an interview and was transported there and read his rights. He agreed to talk to Detective Burr, and the interview began at 5:20 in the morning. JR admitted to being at a New Year's Eve party and gave a list of names of attendees, but he denied killing Patti and said he had no idea who did. Detective Burr tried to pinpoint whether JR had an alibi for the time of the murder, which took place sometime between 11:45 and 1:40 a.m. JR said that on January 1st, Patti drove him to the grocery store at 5:15 and waited while he bought some food. Then she drove him to the apartment where he stayed with his roommate, and he unloaded his stuff and went inside alone. It was 5:30 p.m. He stayed home the rest of the night and watched the football game and a movie on TV. He called Patti around 8, and they were both watching the Poseidon Adventure on television, her with the kids. That was the last time he talked to her. Detective Burr made a note to confirm all of this with the roommate. Burr actually interviewed JR's ex-wives, one of whom he had married twice. His first ex-wife, Nancy, gave statements that tended to incriminate JR. She said he was a macho narcissist who cheated on her and had been diagnosed as a sociopath by his psychologist. He had a hair-trigger temper and had hit her in front of their daughter. He was a pathological liar, she said, and he was absolutely capable of violence, in her opinion. JR's second and third wife, Cassandra, a dealer in Vegas, said that on occasion he hit her and once he threatened her with a knife. Another thing, apparently JR told a couple people after the murder that he didn't think he did it, but he couldn't remember for sure because he was so high on coke that night. Not a good look. Next up on the suspect list was JR's roommate. The roommate worked for a weights and measures firm inventorying cargo ships at the Toledo docks. He sometimes took JR to work with him so he could earn a day laborer wage. The roommate had never been married, and JR admitted to the investigators that he thought this roommate might have a thing for him. Police notes say, quote, "It is our contention that the roommate is a homosexual and that JR is servicing him on a regular basis to maintain the apartment," end quote. I have no idea where they got that from, but if true, it gave the roommate a motive, jealousy of Patti. The roommate was 54 years old, 230 pounds, and somewhat reclusive. Detective Burr noted that the apartment was suspiciously tidy, whatever that means, and the roommate was unsure of himself, nervous, and repetitive during the police interview. He avoided questions and feigned ignorance about things he should know. The roommate told the cops that JR was a womanizer and would get phone calls at all hours from many women. He liked to present a macho man image, he said. If you recall, JR's alibi was that he was home all night watching the Poseidon Adventure and football. He said his roommate was also home and could vouch for him. Unfortunately, this wasn't entirely true. The roommate said he went to bed sometime around midnight, and JR was home when he went to bed. He admitted JR was not within eyesight of him for most of the evening. He did say he never heard JR leave that night, and he usually heard the door, but that wasn't exactly an ironclad alibi for JR. Finally, the investigators asked if JR could have possibly used the roommate's car that evening. Remember, he didn't have his own. The roommate said no way. The keys were in his room. JR had no access to them. And Patti's house was too far away to be really walkable. This was a problem for the investigators. If JR had gone to Patti's to kill her, how did he get there? Burr and his partners continued to sweat JR. They would stop by unannounced and say they were there just to update him or just to check in. They'd say things like, "We don't think the guy who killed her meant to do it." JR finally said, "Do you think I did it?" Well, they did. JR took 2 polygraphs, and the results on both were inconclusive. Burr recalled JR's ex-wife saying he was a sociopath and pathological liar. His notes say, "I have no doubt that he did it." JR denied this over and over and would continue to do so for years to come. The roommate also took 2 polygraphs, which were inconclusive. He, too, remained on the list, although at 230 pounds, there was some doubt whether he could fit out the bathroom window. Okay, now for the other prime suspect, Greg, Patti's ex-husband and the father of her 3 girls. The girls told the detectives that their parents broke up because they got married very young and didn't love each other anymore. But they also said that Greg and Patti didn't really argue and they cared a lot about each other. As I mentioned earlier, Greg had been unfaithful to Patti during the marriage. He told Detective Burr that he was extremely unfaithful for years and slept with a different woman just about every night. The detective's notes say that Greg, quote, is aggressive, demanding, and can be very obnoxious, end quote. This was because the police felt their toes were stepped on a bit by Greg, interfering with the investigation on a number of occasions by calling people that were witnesses or friends of Patti's and asking for information. In a sign of the times, police notes say, quote, although Greg has a quick temper, there was no physical abuse on Patricia. Greg would punch holes in a wall or slap her around a little, end quote. Patti's friend Sharon told the police that although divorced, Greg and Patti were still talking regularly, and Greg might even have been hoping for some sexual favors when he came around to see the kids and drop off some money. That was a non-starter for Patti, though. Greg was taken down to the station and interviewed by Detective Palmer that very night, after he showed up at Patti's house acting hysterical. He told the investigators his ex-wife had been in a really good place lately. She was collecting unemployment and was doing well and seemed to have a good thing going with JR, whom he said seemed like a really good guy. Things were pretty good between himself and Patti, and he had even brought over some liquor and supplies for her New Year's Eve party. He was very emotional when they spoke to him, especially because his girls had been in the house right next to where Patti was killed. Detective Burr's notes say, bluntly, I think he loves the kids too much to splatter Patti a foot away. He thought Patti's stab wounds were more consistent with someone who was panicking or frenzied, not an ex-husband irritated with a former spouse. He noted that the former couple seemed amicable, and Greg spent a lot of time with the kids with no custody battles. But there was one issue. Apparently, Patti had discovered that Greg was selling untaxed cigarettes at his bar, and she had threatened to sue him to get more alimony or child custody. And there were rumors that Greg had had Patti bumped off to save some money. Despite those concerning things, the reality was that Greg had a pretty solid alibi. He was home just after 1:30 a.m. when Andrea called, His girlfriend, Sherry Ann, who lived with him, confirmed that he had been home all night with her after they got home from a party. Detective Burr noted that Sherry Ann looked very similar to Patti. She went to the same high school as Patti and Greg, and that she was cooperative. He seemed to believe her statement that Greg was home at the time of the murder. The last significant suspect from this stage of the investigation was Kevin D., the husband of Patti's close friend, Sharon. Detectives' notes say that Sharon was one of Patti's closest friends, and her information about Patti had been proven to be accurate. Kevin, on the other hand, was deemed to be very immature and was noted to be a little jealous of the closeness that Patti and his wife shared. Some people who were at the party said he acted like a jerk and accused Patti of trying to get his wife laid when they went back in the bedroom with some guys. Some friends of Patti's reported that Kevin never liked Patti because he thought she was a bad influence on his wife. Finally, some people heard him threaten Patti at the party, saying something like, "Stay away from Sharon or you're as good as dead." Kevin was interviewed multiple times but denied killing Patti, and Sharon said they had gone home together that night. It was a conundrum. Detective Corin noted that only moderate drama emerged in the friend, family, and suspect interviews. Patti and JR seemed to get along well. No one had any concrete reason to think he killed Patti. Same with Greg and Mark and Kevin and JR's roommate. No one seemed to have any idea who'd killed her. Detective Burr consulted criminologist Dr. Harley Stocks, showing him the crime scene photos and reviewing law enforcement theories. Stocks stated, quote, "Looking at the crime scene, I think she was killed by someone who knew her, that the guy who did this is going to be an impulsive, immature person, probably who abuses alcohol or drugs, that you are going to see a history in this person of violent acts starting as a juvenile. Whatever criminal record they have is going to revolve more around impulse control problems. He's going to be a guy who's not too well educated, probably a high school dropout in 10th or 11th grade, and he's probably going to be a guy who's probably real cold-blooded, who's not going to care about what he did. It's not going to bother him," end quote. Like a sociopath, asked Detective Burr? Dr. Stock, a sociopath, and the wounds here are what you see in someone who has a lot of anger, who doesn't get his way, and acts out. As January progressed into February and the case remained unsolved, the Sylvania detectives fended off whispers that they weren't qualified to handle this investigation. According to the Toledo Blade, Patti's murder was the first in Sylvania in 70 years. It turned out that the last murder was over 100 years earlier. Police Chief Gerald Saab told the paper, quote, "No one has indicated that there ever was one before, maybe back in the 1800s, end quote. The Sylvania investigators knew that their lack of experience working homicides put them a little bit behind the 8 ball, so they consulted regularly with detectives from the Toledo Police Department who had handled plenty of murders. Burr said he was looking for all the help he could get. By January 11th, it was reported that investigators had worked hundreds of hours following up on scores of tips and interviewing over 65 people. Lead Detective Tom Corin said, quote, "People think because it's the first homicide we've ever handled that we don't know what we're doing, but I feel confident that we're doing things right," end quote. Corin was confident in his own and his department's abilities to solve the case, but not overly so, and he was aware of the limitations of the smaller agency. So by mid-February, they accepted an offer of assistance from the Toledo office of the FBI. The Behavioral Sciences Unit would prepare a personality profile of the man who had killed Patti. This all took 3 months. The FBI profile was delivered to the Sylvania police in May 1985. I don't have it, but I was told that it was very generic and not helpful other than pointing to Patti's boyfriend JR and the partygoers. The FBI was also provided with the nylon knife sheath to submit it to special laser treatments in an attempt to gain fingerprints. That didn't work. Speaking of the sheath, the detectives were frustrated that the information about the sheath appeared in the Toledo Blade. They were hoping to maintain that as holdback information. By March of 1985, due to numerous letters of concern written by citizens, the Sylvania City Council passed an ordinance establishing a reward fund to be awarded to anyone providing information leading to the arrest and indictment of Patti's killer. This was separate from Crime Stoppers, which also published requests for information from the public and offered a reward in Patti's case. The reward money went unclaimed. Several years passed. In 1988, hypnotist Vince Sheehan hypnotized Andrea to see if they could maximize her recall of the night of the murder. She was resistant and the session was deemed not successful. Detective Burr later told the Toledo Blade, quote, "We think Andrea heard something and got up. We don't know if she saw the killer. We may never know. Andrea had repressed her memories of finding her mother and what she had seen and heard that terrible night. All Patti's girls struggled with the senseless murder of their mom, knowing that the guy who did it was walking free, possibly even among them, just as he had walked in their house that fateful night. In 1993, Patti's brother Robert spoke with the Toledo Blade about his sister's baffling unsolved homicide. "There's a big void there," he said. "Who did it? Why? Unless it was somebody who just ventured off the street, somebody has to know who did it." In 1998, more than nearly a decade and a half after Patti was stabbed to death in her bedroom, Sylvania Police Chief Gerald Saab sought the blessing of the family to reopen the case. It was readily given by Patti's parents, children, and siblings. 2 full-time detectives were tasked with solving the case. Sylvania Detective Michael Junker and Sergeant Greg Brilhart reopened the investigation and began inventorying all the evidence they had to work with. They learned that things were not optimal. A February 5, 1998 memo to the file notes that they had been unable to locate Patti's underwear, the 2 broken nails, 3 missing blood samples, body cavity swabbings and hair samples from Patti, the bedroom door, and the bathroom light switch plate cover. The black sweatshirt Patti was wearing that night was also missing and turned out to have been inadvertently destroyed in 1993 by the Toledo police after being cleared for release from the property room. I know, it's excruciating. Chief Saab wrote to the BCI and requested a review of the case. The cold case review was taking place firmly within the DNA era, and part of the reinvestigation involved determining what DNA evidence they had to work with. In February 1998, the Sylvania Police Department submitted to the state agency the physical evidence items they had for trace evidence, DNA, and prints. A BCI lab report dated May 20, 1998, gave the results of a serological exam. The knife sheath and the 2 towels draped over the tub were all negative for the presence of blood. The shower curtain and curtain liner tested as possible for the presence of blood. Now, I should mention that it was 1998. It was just the beginning of DNA usage in Ohio. So they wanted to see if they could get DNA from any of the items in evidence. They started with Patti's carpet, thinking the suspect might have left some biological evidence there as he struggled with Patti. But a June 1998 report on testing on blood spots on the carpet reported that all the blood was Patti's. One of the things they did still have in evidence were the 8 false nail tips removed from Patti at autopsy. On November 10, 1998, BCI analyst Cassandra Augusti called Detective Junker to report she had located what appeared to be clumps of blood or substance on 2 of the nails and other traces of blood on some of the other nails. They agreed to submit the nails to LabCorp to see if DNA could be obtained. The Sylvania investigators also had a latent print examiner at the Miami Valley Crime Lab in Dayton analyze the fingerprints found on the butt end of the tub wall. He determined that one of the latent prints matched the left middle finger of J.R., Patti's boyfriend. They asked him if he had ever showered at Patti's house, and he said yes many times. His regular presence in the house was definitely an obstacle to using the fingerprint as evidence against J.R. Aside from the physical evidence testing, the 1998 investigators interviewed and re-interviewed 36 people. J.R., Greg, the girls, Patti's parents, a bunch of the neighbors. Let's talk about some of these interviews. Looking back at the 1985 investigators' notes, Junker and Brilhart focused on some things they did not feel were sufficiently followed up on by the original investigators. One of these was the report by the neighbor, Andrea J., about the Audi parked in front of Patti's house, close to midnight on the night of the murder. Alice A., who lived next door to Patti and knew her pretty well, was certain that that car was not there at around 10:30 when she and Lloyd, her boyfriend, who had alerted Patti to the peeping Tom, took the trash out. The 1998 detectives went to see Andrea J. in Toledo in February of that year. She remembered the night well. She said she and Joe, her now husband, were on one of their first dates, and they got back to her parents' house around 11:30 p.m. on the night of January 1st. A car she was not familiar with was parked on the west side of the street, facing southbound right across from her parents' driveway. To enhance her recall, Andrea was hypnotized in March of '98. I always find it fascinating that they can elicit details even a decade after the crime. She said she and Joe arrived at her house at 11:34 p.m., as she saw on the clock in Joe's car. The car parked across the street from her house was a 2-door sports car, baby blue, with a high rear end. There was a silver luggage rack on the trunk, and it had silver hubcaps with a Toyota emblem in the center. She believed it was a temporary tag Ohio, JP 6345H. Spoiler alert, this lead went absolutely nowhere. To this day, it's unknown whose car that was parked on Patti Street. Now I'm going to get into the 1998 interviews of Patti's daughters. Apparently, the three had been interviewed on the night of the murder, but not thoroughly since. In March of '98, Brillhart and Junker traveled to Florida to interview Andrea. Andrea said her recollections of the night were largely impressions that were hazy. It was evident that Andrea was tortured by witnessing or almost witnessing the murder of her mother, and she was very unsure about what she actually remembered and what she imagined. Andrea said she never really talked about what happened to her mom, and she didn't get therapy until much, much later. She was very confused and had a lot of stress and frustration in her adolescence. Andrea firmly believed that her mother did not have someone over with whom she had an angry confrontation. She said, quote, "I think my mom was in her bed and had no idea. First of all, my mom would not bring someone to her room to have a confrontation. She would have talked to someone in our family room, furthest from our bedrooms where we were sleeping. Secondly, she would not be wearing her underpants, no matter who was there. It could be JR, it could be Greg. She doesn't sit around like that. She never ever walked around the house in her underpants ever. So I think she was in bed and the person planned it, came over, walked in the house and did it. Before she had a chance to realize what was going on, she was starting to be stabbed immediately." End quote. Andrea pointed out that where the blood was on the bed looked like Patti was stabbed when she was lying down. She felt strongly that the suspect would have been covered in blood, and after he jumped out the window, he very likely ran back behind the house where the woods were. Andrea was hypnotized on May 10, 1998. I don't have the records from hypnosis, but I do have the detective's summary, which says, quote, "It appears certain now that she was awake during the assault on her mother and at least heard what was taking place. The information she gave also would seem to narrow down the time frame of the murder to about 23:30 hours to about 0:30 hours." The 1998 detectives Junker and Brillhart were again looking at JR as their prime suspect. This was for all the same reasons as before, although these investigators focused on his violent tendencies. Their notes say, quote, "Investigation reveals that he had committed serious assaults to his previous wife and made fatal threats with a knife to another wife." End quote. JR had remarried after Patti, and this ex-wife said he punched her in the face and broke her car window in a jealous rage. So Brillhart and Junker pulled JR in again for questioning. They said he was visibly upset when he arrived, and he cried on more than one occasion during the interview. He adamantly denied killing Patti and said he would do anything to clear himself. They had him write out a statement of the details he remembered of that evening. JR did as they asked and wrote on the bottom, "Please find out who did this." He also willingly gave DNA samples, which were collected in case any DNA evidence was obtained, and he agreed to take a computer voice stress analyzer exam. They made an appointment for that exam, but on that date, JR called and said he was sick and unable to attend. It turned out his attorney advised him not to take any tests or talk to the police further, so that was the end of that. So instead, they gave the voice stress test to JR's roommate, whom he was once again living with. He maintained that JR never left that evening or early morning and did not use his car that night, so the investigators had learned nothing new. Then they turned to a new suspect. In 1988, a 27-year-old truck driver was arrested who would prove to be a serial killer. Michael Lee Lockhart was accused of killing at least 6 people in a cross-country murder, rape, and robbery spree. Okay, so what? What are the chances this guy was the person who broke into Patti's home and killed her in her bedroom? Well, Lockhart was from Toledo. When he was arrested in Texas on March 22, 1988 for the murder of police officer Paul Halsey Jr., other states like Indiana and Florida lined up to file charges against him for crimes he'd committed in their jurisdictions. Lockhart was executed by the state of Texas on December 9, 1997. They just got first dibs. Lockhart was also sentenced to death in Florida and Indiana. When the 1998 Sylvania investigators learned that Lockhart was a serial killer and that he was a Toledo native, they took a look at him for the only murder in Sylvania in the investigators' lifetimes. Lockhart had killed a suspected 5 women and had used a knife in some of his crimes. And Lockhart and his wife lived in Toledo at the time of Patti's murder, and their home was very near the 21st Century Health Club where she worked. That was an interesting coincidence. Perhaps Lockhart, a big, burly guy, had spotted Patti at the fitness club, and she became his first known victim. Lockhart had been arrested in Cheyenne, Wyoming on October 17, 1984 for armed robbery, but he was out on bond from Laramie County between November 16, 1984 and January 25, 1985. This was, of course, the window of time in which Patti's murder occurred, and Lockhart's wife confirmed that his parents had posted his bond in Wyoming and brought him back to Toledo. Lockhart had confessed to some of his murders, but by the time Sylvania law enforcement became interested in him, he was dead and couldn't be interviewed. Investigators could do no more to connect him to Patti's murder. He remained a good suspect, and I'll revisit him in a bit. You'll remember that 8 of Patti's fingernails were in evidence and had been sent to the BCI for analysis to see if there was any foreign DNA on the nails. In January of 1999, Detective Junker received a call from Cassandra Augusti of BCI. LabCorp had informed her that they located some DNA from the right thumbnail. They used 40% of the substance from the nail to obtain a minimal DNA sample, but they would need to use the remaining 60% for higher percentage DNA. Detective Junker authorized Ms. Augusti to authorize LabCorp to go ahead and use the remaining substance from the nail. Eventually, material from all the nails would be combined in hopes of finding a profile, which consumed all the samples and did not yield a viable DNA sample for comparison. During this era of the investigation, no DNA was found other than Patti's on any items of evidence. Nonetheless, quite a few DNA samples were collected from persons of interest as the detectives continued to re-interview people connected to Patti. Voluntary samples were obtained from Lloyd, Mark F., Greg, J.R. and his roommate, and men from the party like Jeffrey H., married to Patti's friend Kathy. On June 8, 2001, Detective Junker and Sergeant Brilhart met with Chief Saab regarding a request from Carol Stichler, Patti's sister. She wanted to have the new Lucas County Cold Case Squad review Patti's case. So a meeting was held with the Cold Case Squad on July 10, 2001, to update them on the case and the status of the investigation. Attendees included Tom Ross of the Lucas County Prosecutor's Office, Lieutenant Don Atkinson from the Lewis County Sheriff's Office, Diane Barnett from the Lucas County Coroner's Office, Detective Sergeant Steve Forrester of Toledo Police, and Agent Scott Smith of the FBI. A February 2002 memo from Detective Junker to the file indicated that the Cold Case Squad had not found anything that the Sylvania police had not already done in that investigation. Well, that was incorrect. There was something that had not been done. They had not found the missing evidence. On May 23, 2002, the Toledo Police Crime Lab Director Diana Kapolka was conducting an inventory in the crime lab after the officer in charge of the lab retired, and she discovered something in a filing cabinet. They were items of physical evidence from the Stichler crime scene that had not been returned to Sylvania police. Items that had not been located despite a physical search of the lab in 1998. And what that meant was that they had not been incorporated into the items that were submitted for DNA testing in the extensive 1998 reinvestigation. It was a major screw-up. The things that were found were, quote, 3 additional pieces of evidence that were collected from the Brent Haven crime scene were located in the Toledo Police Crime Lab. These were 3 manila evidence envelopes containing 1. A blood sample from the bathroom window point of exit, 2. A blood sample from the west bathtub wall, and 3. The brown light switch plate from the bathroom wall which had a blood smear on it. Needless to say, Detective Junker was eager to collect these items of evidence, which had never been subjected to DNA testing. He picked them up on May 23, 2002, and immediately submitted them to the BCI Crime Lab in Bowling Green for DNA processing. The crime lab was requested to test the blood on all 3 of these items and compare the DNA in the samples to female blood on the carpet from under Patti's body, which they were using as a DNA standard for her. If it matched, they knew that it was Patti's blood in the bathroom. If it didn't match, the lab was to test the foreign DNA against JR's DNA sample. The results of the BCI lab testing were documented in a lab report dated December 2, 2002. The findings were as follows. Presumptive testing indicated the presence of blood on all 3 samples. The blood sample from the bathroom window was Patti's. The blood sample from the bathtub wall was Patti's. And the blood sample on the light switch was a mixture, with Patti being the minor contributor and an unknown male being the major contributor. The male DNA profile on the light switch plate was not consistent with JR. For the first time in the investigation, they had foreign DNA from an unidentified male to work with. The male STR DNA profile was entered into CODIS in 2002 with no hits. This is the end of Part 1 of the Patti Stichler case. Part 2 is available right now.